My name's Eric Jacobson. I'm on the board of the New Jersey Association for Lifelong Learning, and I generally facilitate these free webinars. So I'm happy that you're joining us here today. And I'm also happy that Art Ellison is joining us, as well as Barry Semple and Hal Beater, who are on the board of NJALL. And what we want to talk about today is what potential changes in federal funding mean for New Jersey. New Jersey, more than any other states, is sort of dependent upon federal funding, which Barry and Hal will talk about. And we brought Art in to share his experience as as an adult ed director in New Hampshire to think about how we engage both in advocacy, but then also how we stay on top of what the process is at the federal level. We often don't know what's going on in DC because we're so involved with our local program. But what happens in DC does have an immediate impact on what you're doing in the local program. So Art's going to talk a little bit about kind of where we are now in the budget cycle, and then some key points about advocacy, both sort of general and then also advocacy at the state level. And then Hal's going to talk a little bit about New Jersey, and then Barry's going to talk a little bit about local issues within New Jersey, and then we should have time at the end for open conversation with everybody that's online. So hope everybody understands what we're going to do, and if that sounds good, then I'm going to turn things over to Art now.
Thank you, Eric, and thanks for inviting me to be part of this. I'm very passionate about advocacy for adult ed and have about 39 years of experience doing it here in New Hampshire and at the national level. So hopefully what I can share will be helpful. And as I've said before to many people, I'm always willing to share my sort of wisdom or ignorance on all of these topics, and you'll have to sort that out. Let's look at first FY18. This is the appropriations, the bill and the budget for FY18. And we started on this process way back in March of last year when the president submitted his budget proposal to Congress, and that had a 16% cut in it for adult education. Over the course of the year, both the House and Senate sort of rejected the proposal and got us to, we were pretty sure, level funding. That brings us to tomorrow. And the continuing resolution on this bill runs out tomorrow, and I have some good news to share. We don't often get to do this, but last night the House and Senate agreed on a huge $1.3 trillion budget. It will go to the president tomorrow for his approval. And just before I got on this call 10 minutes ago, we dug through the 2,300-page bill. And it turns out that adult education is getting a $35 million increase for this fiscal year. That means that this is money that the states will get in July of this year. That's about a 7% increase. And to put this in perspective, we worked hard on getting support in the House and Senate to not go along with the 16% cut. And so that happened. We sort of made sure the 16% didn't go through, and we added 7% on top of that. We will be sending things out through the various national networks, sort of saying to folks, look at the work that we did, and it was hard work, paid off to the tune of $35 million. So on this, when I put the slide together, we were looking at the prospects for additional funding. We got it, or we will have it as of tomorrow when the president signs this budget. What that means for New Jersey is sort of 7% in the ballpark. What Octave does, and this is where the money comes from, they use a population-based formula from the previous year of the number of adults in the state who don't have a high school diploma. And so it follows population trends a little bit. Last year when this happened, some states under level funding got a 3 or 4% increase, some lost 3 or 4%. So it will not be clear until mid-May or late May when Octave notifies the state office in New Jersey of what that grant is going to be for July. But it should be hopefully in the around 7%. Any questions on that?
So Art, I do have a question about that. So is that really just driven by Octane and a quantitative analysis. Is there room for advocacy around what each state gets, or is that really out of their hands and it's just driven by a formula?
It's just driven by a formula, and it's in the legislation, which says the money under Title II, we all adult ed, will be distributed based on the number of adults without a high school diploma in each state.
Okay.
And so that's in the legislation, and that sort of, it spits out what it spits out. So the key becomes, what is the base number that we're dealing with? And in this case, it's the base number plus 7%.
Okay. So in some ways, that connects adult ed advocacy to other things that we need to think about at the federal level. So I know, for example, there's been recent concern about the census, right? There's no head of the Census Bureau, and people are concerned about how the census is going to be rolled out. So it's possible that if your state undercounts or is undercounted in terms of the number of adults who need English or who need diplomas, then the money that you get is not going to be proportionate.
That's correct. I mean, and you know, we all want a robust and accurate census count. Whether or not that happens is unclear at this point.
Right. So this is, I think, one of the things where those of us who are committed to adult education have to keep our eyes on many, many balls that are up in the air, right? So it's not simply the direct funding stream, but there's many things that might affect that funding stream.
Yeah, exactly.
Any questions from folks about kind of where we are at FY18 before Art moves on to thinking about next year already? So you can do that by either raising your hand or by using the question area. And it's nice that you bring us good news this morning, Art, about that.
I know. I don't get to do that very often. So,
yeah.
Yes.
All right. So then let's move on to FY19.
Okay. This process started about 5 weeks ago when the president submitted his budget proposal for FY19 to Congress. And in that budget, we also were in line for another 16% cut. Based on what's happened and will happen tomorrow, we're pretty sure that the Congress will not accept that budget proposal in a whole number of ways, but certainly for adult education. The proposal is before the House Appropriations Subcommittee, the Labor, Health and Human Services Education Related Agency Subcommittee, and Secretary DeVos testified before them this week on that particular budget proposal. I have a specific request, and I'm thinking this will move next week. And you noticed up here something called a Dear Colleague letter. Dear Colleague letters are letters that a specific senator or senators or members of the House sign saying, in our case, adult education should receive more funding. And they then circulate those letters to all the members of the House and the Senate saying, would you please sign on to this letter supporting my request for additional adult ed funding? We think that the Dear Colleague letters will start to move next week. Senator Reid from Rhode Island, who has been a sponsor of those for the years, will be putting one out. And the key will be to have all of us contact our U.S. Senate offices and ask them. The ask will be to sign the Reid Dear Colleague letter on adult education. Now, going back last year, we had 19 senators who signed on. I think Senator Menendez was on that letter, and actually Senator Booker might have been as well. There are two things that need to be done. One person from the organization needs to take the lead and call the education staff person in each of those offices, Booker and Menendez, and specifically make the request. Their Dear Colleague letter is coming, and you send them the Reid letter and say, would the senator please sign this? We need to have that direct connection there so that they get back to you. What the second part that happens then is we do this through telephone calls, because generally we'll have about 10 to 12 days to deal with these. And it's just, we want to have hundreds, thousands of calls going into those offices, and they're very quick calls. It's just, I'm an adult ed student, I'm an adult ed staff person, and I'm calling to ask that Senator Menendez, Senator Booker sign the Reid Dear Colleague letter on adult education. Thank you very much. It takes 20 seconds. So those are the two things that we will be asking for starting next week. And I mean, it's hard when you go through a whole year of national advocacy, in this case, to point to what was it that got us the 7%, because there were a whole lot of things going on. But dear colleague letters are very, very important. It's unclear at this point whether we'll have one in the House, but if we have one in the House, then the call will go out and you'd have to do the same thing. You would want an adult educator from each congressional district calling that member's office with the same request. Please have the member sign, and we don't know who it would be at this point, but it may be Congressman Rowe's dear colleague letter on adult ed, and then we would go forward. So it's a very specific task that we can all do, and your organization is in a position to make this happen. As we go forward after that, we will be focusing on the Senate and House Appropriations subcommittees and the full committee. At this point, New Jersey doesn't have anyone on either the House or Senate on there, so we would tailor something that could be done. But we focus first on the subcommittee members, then the full Appropriations Committee members, and that will be a campaign which will pick up some steam very quickly. But the key here is doing the dear colleague letters.
So Art, what you're describing is really kind of like a two-phase process, right? Where like before the letter itself is formally circulated, we know that it's going to be, we know that it's going to be out there. And so that's when particular organizations need to contact the reps' offices. Then once the letter is formally distributed to the people within the Senate or people within the House, that's when individuals need to get on the phone and call those offices.
Yeah, I think that's the way that would work. I think I would say that the campaign shouldn't start until the letter is out, because the person who makes that contact sends along the read dear colleague letter, and the staff people get it because Senator Reid's office will do that.
Yeah.
But for him to get it, or for his office, for their offices to get it from somebody in New Jersey, and they have it right in front of them, so that triggers it when the dear colleague letter is available.
Okay. In the past, for those of you that are online now and get NJALL emails, if you remember last year, we did send out a constant contact alert about the dear colleague letter, and we had links for each one of the reps from the state, both at the Senate level and also at the House level. So this is the type of thing that NJALL as an organization can use feedback on. What would make it easier for you to connect and make those phone calls, and also make it easier for you to encourage other people to make those phone calls? In our email, we've got a link to the reps' contact information, and we also had sample letters to read and to send. So anything that we can do to help make your advocacy easier and also help you encourage other people to do so, please let us know and send it to the NJALL Gmail account. Or if you have ideas that you want to share right now about what would help in terms of doing things like a timely dear colleague letter call in. And Hal, you're unmuted right now. So do you want to say anything about that, about kind of working at the state level to get dear colleague letter support?
I think this is it's something we can do. It's very specific. It's not terribly complex. We got to move on it.
Okay. All right. So Rebecca's saying that we could send the phone number. So I think what we've done in the past is we've had a link, but maybe rather than having the link, we can send the direct phone number, and then that way people can make that call. I think with the dear colleague letter, Art, the call itself doesn't have to be that long, right? You're just simply asking support the dear colleague letter vis-a-vis funding for adult education.
That's it. It takes 20 seconds.
Yeah, they're not asking you for the kind of a blow by blow of why they should support it, right?
That's correct.
Okay.
That's correct. And they're keeping a good count of how many calls they get.
Right. And this is a situation where phone calls are better than, fax or email, right?
That's correct, just because of the time frame on that. And I will put this out. I mean, I'll put a copy of the letter, hopefully the Senator Reid letter, out early next week when it's available through the SPOC network, the single point of contact network that I administer. Some of you are on that, but Eric, I'll make sure that you have that copy. Just as soon as I get it, I'll send that letter.
Okay, and then I'll turn that around to folks on the constant contact email list. So also for those of you that are on this call and that you got the information from being on the NJALL constant contact email list, please encourage your colleagues to sign up and to join our mailing list, because that's the easiest way for us to get in touch with them. All right, so then, Art, I think you wanted to talk a little bit about sort of advocacy more generally. So here's some very specific things that we've been talking about, but I also think you have some ideas more generally about how to think about advocacy and how to advocate successfully.
Yes, thank you, Eric. What's coming up now are just the basic principles of advocacy that have become apparent to me over the years, and they're quotes, and I use them in the workshops that I do around the politics of adult education. I don't want to go through them all, but I just want to highlight 2 or 3 because I think it's important for us to all remember some of these key principles. And the most important one on the whole sheet is up in front of you. It's: no one believes that adult education has a constituency that we need to pay attention to. Now, that's from a chair of, and I don't remember which state it was from, but the chair of the House Ways and Means Committee. That is key. That is key at the state level. That's key at the federal level. We've made some inroads into that, but basically that's what we're dealing with. And we have to have policy. We have to make policy makers aware that there's a constituency that they need to pay attention to. That takes us into the involvement of students, and it takes us into looking at legislative districts and things like that. But that's a key one there. The other one that I would highlight would be on the next slide, which is those who show up make the decisions, from my favorite president, Jed Bartlett from the West Wing, who is, if you remember, was from New Hampshire, actually. But for too long, at the national level and at the state level, we have not been showing up to make the decisions. Every state, whether you have an annual budget cycle or a biennial budget cycle, moves forward with a process to determine how much money, if any, or how much money is going to be put into the budget for adult education. At the end of the cycle, usually in June of every year, before the beginning of the next fiscal year, there is a number that's put in there for adult education. And if we are not part of the process to determine what that number is going to be, someone else will make the decisions for us, because there will be a number there. There are others. I guess the other one that I would want to frame would be the next slide, which is from Alex Harris from Iowa. And data helps to frame the situation, but the story of students and programs is what paints the canvas. That becomes a discussion that you have within your organization of how to frame what you want to send, particularly on the state level. We find that state legislators fall into 2 categories here. There's one group that wants numbers. They want to know how many students in adult ed come from their district. They want to know how many people got a high school equivalency certificate from the program. They want to know how many people went on to post-secondary education. There's another group of state legislators who really will react to testimonials or testimonials of students. They remember these 2 student stories that they had, and there's no magic to this, but you've done this before, but need to think about how you frame the story of adult education for policymakers. And then my favorite quote at the end, which is general philosophy on my part: pray for the dead and fight like hell for the living. Any questions?
Yeah, I mean, if people have questions, please chime in. But Art, I wanted to really reemphasize what the person from Iowa had to say in terms of data is important, but it's really student stories that I think that open people's eyes, right? So that's why students going to Trenton, students going to your local organization, students, contacting your federal level reps really makes a difference. We can send flyers and we can send information, and that's helpful. But I think it's really when they see these folks face to face that also makes the connection to constituency, right? So it's not just data, but here's a person in front of me that can vote, and people connected to them that can vote. So I think having stories of students at the ready is really important, right? So at NJALL, we've got 4 kind of advocacy flyers that we're starting to distribute, and we made the conscious decision to make sure that we had a couple of student stories to go with some of them, right? So it wasn't just abstract. But I think having those in the ready is really important. So if something happens, you're not in the situation of then going out to try to round up some student stories in an ad hoc fashion. I think to have that information and have those narratives on hand is really, really important.
I completely agree with you, Eric. We're in the process right now of stuffing the envelopes that we're doing a mailing to all state representatives and to the governor. And there are 2 pieces of information in there. One is our quick and dirty one end of the year data report, which lists, in our case, we served 7,700 students and they did this and that. The second piece of information is 8 student stories, which have
Right.
pictures and maybe 1 or 2 paragraphs for each one. And that's how we're trying to cover both ends of that spectrum in terms of sort of how you connect. And then the other thing, which everybody on this call is aware of, is the power of the student letters. I mean, this is built, all our advocacy campaigns are built on student letters. And the student letters are always the same in terms of format. 1, why the student enrolled in the program. 2, what he or she wants to do when they leave, and then the ask, and we sort of determine what the ask is going to be. It can be as simple as please support funding for adult education. 1 year it may be please increase funding for adult education. We have a biennial budget in New Hampshire, so we're in a non-budget year, but in order to keep sort of adult ed in front of the policy makers, we've started this process a couple months ago, but we will put 2,500 letters on the desk of the governor. And those will be those student letters that I just described. And we'll do 5,000 with the legislature, which those are now going forward. But that fills in that student story part, as well as sort of what you get in terms of the testimonials.
Right. So one of the things that NJALL has started discussing is that in short term, we want to hold signing sessions in different parts of the state, right? To have an event where people can come in and sign letters to all their reps. So if you're interested in being involved in kind of helping us organize these things around the state, please send us an email at the NJALL Gmail account. The hope is that we have a northern one, a central one, and a southern one, so that both students and teachers can come in and kind of sign these letters. Anybody with any thoughts about some of these basic principles before Art moves on to some ideas about state level advocacy? I'll take that as an affirmative. The other thing I'll mention is Makiko, the Jed Bartlett is a fictional president from a popular TV show. So, all right. So, Art, do you want to say anything about kind of the idea of state level campaigns? And this is really important in New Jersey because to date, as I mentioned at the top of the webinar, we get the majority of our funding through the federal level. So it's really important that we get more money from the state. And so we're really going to try to push on talking to the state about raising how much it supports adult education directly. So Art, you want to talk about some of the things that you think really help at the state level?
Sure. This is I think it may be titled 11 Essential Elements for State Advocacy Campaigns. Just pulled this together from working in many states over the years and figuring out kind of what makes this work. And there are just some general principles on that. One is understanding the process, understanding sort of where does a budget start? Where does it go? Who, the governor's involved. When does it go to the legislature? Who gets it in the legislature? The second concept, which is very important for us, is targeting. And we target the key people in the in the legislature. So we focus on members initially of the appropriations or finance committees, depending on what you have, and we make sure that the key members who make decisions about funding understand everything there is to know about adult education and people in their districts. And that's the key, and we have to keep telling ourselves this. In your case, somebody, a state rep from Newark, doesn't want to hear from a state rep from Trenton. They only want to hear from constituents in their districts. So we target these people. And in New Hampshire, we have 8 people that are on the finance subcommittee in the House, which is where the governor's budget goes and where the process starts. And we make sure those 8 people, we have comprehensive contacts between constituents in their districts and those 8 people so that they understand everything that we do. And then this just leads to the third principle, which is alignment. We align the state legislative districts of those key people with the adult education programs, and we simply basically take a map and put one on top of the other, so that if the chair of this finance subcommittee is from, could be Laconia, New Hampshire, we know where we have a program in Laconia. We know exactly what the dimensions are of that member's district. We know which students we have live in that district, and we go forward with that. I'll jump down to number 6 on this list, and it says the rule of 6. It's we try to have our local program directors in, I would say, constant contact with all members of the legislature. So we suggest that there be 6 contacts in the year between them. We want to be in a position where we can interact with policymakers beyond just asking them for money every year. Obviously, that's part of the process, but we want to set up a relationship so that they know, between people who work in adult education or allies in adult education and the policymakers. Number 7.
Before we move on, so under this rule of 6, one of the things that you have noted is congratulations letters. Can you say a little bit more about that?
Sure. The day after well, it's not the day after the election in November. It's usually a week later when we get the official results for all 400 members of the New Hampshire House and our 24 senators. And the local adult ed program director sends a letter of congratulations to all members of the legislature who serve students in that program, congratulating them on being elected or being reelected. But that's the start of this thing. Okay. And they're going. I mean, it's part of that process of connecting with people.
Do you ever, as part of this kind of relationship developing process, ask the reps to send congratulations to students or to programs, like when they graduate, when they finish, when they reach particular milestones, so that they get to kind of step in and say, like, this is what we provide and we're glad that you took advantage of it?
Well, if you see at the end of that one, it's not at the end, it's not on there. Graduations, we make a big heavy attempt for all local programs to get as many state legislators to graduation as possible, and we all understand how you make that connection between a policymaker and individual students cannot be any stronger than having them at graduation. So people spend a lot of time doing it. It takes a lot of work because you got to set your graduation date, and then you got to back it up, and you got to maybe contact folks 2 or 3 times. But we have lots of legislators, so we get a lot of them on the stage. In a big program, we can have 20 to 25 legislators on the stage. And when someone shows up for graduation, we identify them all and individually as champions for adult education. And that has helped us build historically this context where people understand, policymakers understand the program and are willing to support it. Go ahead.
So for the folks on online, so raise your virtual hand if your program has successfully done this, that you've brought reps in to kind of be there for graduations or other important ceremonies. Carol's program has done that. Marlene's program has done that. Thomas's program has done that. So a few. So maybe one thing that we can do is try to collect the kind of best practices and wisdom of programs that have done this successfully within the state, and then share that, because I think that would be really important. Nick asked, that seems like a lot of work. So who coordinates that activity in New Hampshire in terms of getting the reps there?
The local program director does it. The local program director knows who the, let's say, 12 state reps are that serve students from that in that program, and the state, that local director does that.
Okay. All right, great. So Art, you want to say anything about the next two?
Just now, but I'll just finish with the 9 and 10, which would be the next slide. These successful campaigns have to have student contacts, and this is sort of a generalization on my part of looking at successful campaigns in state after state after state, and that 80% of the contacts come from students and 20% from the rest of us. We have been somewhat successful when we try to run our own, but the key to this is having students advocate on behalf of themselves and adult education with their elected representatives. And then the other one that sort of leads us to number 10, which we call the threshold number. And someone needs to figure out what the threshold number is in New Jersey. And that's simply the number of contacts that a state representative needs to have them consider an issue being important. It doesn't have to be adult ed, it could be anything. But you ask that question of, if you don't know it already, some friends in the legislature, and the point that we found out is the number is very, very, very low. We tend to think that if we can't get 500 letters to a legislator, then in fact they're not going to listen to us. I have not found a state, and this is across the country, where it's been above, the threshold number has been above 50. And generally it sits down in the range of 25 to 30 to 35. And that is doable. In a campaign moving forward on student letters, that is very, very, very doable. So just knowing what that number is and finding out that it's not as high as we might think it is important.
Hal, do you want to hazard a guess about what that number is in Trenton?
I have no idea.
So that's something we certainly should find out then.
Yeah, this is a new proposition. I think this is a very important point.
Yeah, I mean, I think it is an important point that sometimes that we think that we only get the rep's ear if it's hundreds of thousands of contacts, but that's not necessarily the case. I mean, I think, Art, this goes back to kind of your point about who shows up, right? And yep. so that it doesn't maybe take a lot to be one that shows up, right? So that you're actually doing some of the legwork. It's not as big a ask as you might think.
It's not, and I mean, in moving forward on this, we all need 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 programs to go ahead and do this, and then you get the results, and then you go in the direction that you're talking about, or share that with other people, like it's doable. You need programs. You need who say, look, I did this, and you can be inviting people to graduation, or it can be simply generating these letters, and then saying and finding out that in fact those letters, now getting over the threshold number doesn't mean necessarily that the legislator agrees with you, but it does mean that he or she has to pay attention to you or to their students or to their constituents is what we're talking about.
Right. And I think, as you were saying before, the phrasing of the contact is really important, right? It can't sound generic, and it has to make clear that you're a constituent. Right.
That's
so it's
correct.
not simply kind of random person that's contacting them.
Right. So some research has to be done either by the local program folks or by students. I mean, with 400 people in our house, I mean, we've got legislative districts that have 1,300 people in them, and students do a good job of going through the state directory and figuring out who lives in which district, and then that's the information that goes out. If I live in Laconia, here are my 3 state representatives and the adult ed program. We're all working on this together. I then have the addresses for those 3 people. But someone has to do that kind of research particularly at the local level. Because you may, I mean, it depends. You're going to have at least the state senator, and you're going to have at least one state rep. And my guess is in a larger program, you'll have more than one state representative who has constituents in your program.
Right. I actually want you to speak about number 11 here. That in terms of not doing this on our own, right? Earlier in the webinar, sort of came up that something like the census is important, right? So when you're going before your representative government and you're asking for increases in adult education, who are some of the allies that you have developed in New Hampshire that have kind of helped you with that message?
We had a great, the local people do this. We start with business and industry, and whenever we start a process, we say to the local program folks, what businesses have you worked with over the last 3 years? And that may be doing off-site adult ed in a particular business. It may be having businesses refer workers in for ESOL or getting a high school equivalency or whatever. And that's where we start. That becomes the top of the list. And every year we say, and I ask, would you send me the list of people that you identify as allies? Just a quick story on this. I was doing this kind of workshop in Florida, and toward the end of the session, a woman who hadn't said anything raised her hand. We were in Orlando, and she said, well, I live in Orlando, and I know the CEO of Disney very well. She said, do you think it would be helpful if I got a letter from Disney in support of adult ed funding? And of course, we all nodded our heads and said yes. The point that I make is we all have Disneys in our local communities. We have banks, we have chambers of commerce, we have business, we have medical associations, we have utilities. And if they can help, they are really powerful in carrying our message too. And we ask them when we're in the middle of the campaign, would you be willing to write a letter to the chair of the Senate Appropriations, whatever, in support of our request for more money? And we find in half of the cases, people are willing to do that. And in that half of them want us to write the letter for them.
I also think that,
fun.
right. I also think that, we need to really connect to other advocacy groups, right? So, currently in the state, I know that the new governor is trying to turn over a new leaf in terms of immigrant integration and immigrant support, right? So that might be an area where we can build these networks and build these alliances in terms of getting support for more ESL, more ABE, and kind of making it all of a piece, even if we're coming at it from slightly different directions.
Yes, it's very important.
Yeah. All right. So,
that's it for me, I think.
Right. So how, any things that you want to add about what you've heard about what Art said or what we've said about the state of New Jersey?
Just a comment. One of the problems with advocacy historically is that we don't have a heck of a lot of resources, and it seems so daunting, such a huge mountain to climb. And one reason I really like this presentation is because it is broken down into doable things. And that's really, really important. You can look at this and say, we can do this with our resources. So this, I think this is extremely useful so far. Eric, you want me to go on for New Jersey?
Yeah. So I want to talk a little about New Jersey, particularly, I think some people understand how vulnerable we are to any potential cuts at the federal level, but maybe you could expand on that a little bit.
Sure. Art and I go way back. Barry goes way back. When the federal program first started, it was part of the war on poverty. And the ideology behind adult literacy was primarily social justice. We did adult literacy because it was the fair thing to do in a democracy. The adult literacy legislation got attached to the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. And the consequence of that is that most programs historically in the country were attached to public schools. time went by. And as time went by, uh, adult literacy became more and more a workforce program rather than a social justice program. That doesn't mean there's not plenty of adult educators that care about social justice. We certainly do. But from a social point of view and a political point of view, it became more and more workforce. And at the same time, it grew up in a very haphazard way, so that adult education delivery system became very, very fragmented. About 20 years ago, we in New Jersey did a study to look at that problem, and we found that adult literacy was funded by 21 different funding streams. The major federal program was in education. Adult high school was in education. There's a big piece in health and services, welfare, even a program in agriculture. And this was diluting our effort to reach our learners. So we harped upon a reorganization. And the result of that organization was that adult literacy went out of the Department of Education into the Department of Labor. Okay? And some of the other funding streams got consolidated. It was an imperfect consolidation, but it moved adult literacy into our Department of Labor. Then comes the latest legislation, which is the Workforce Innovation and Opportunities Act, WIOA. And WIOA solidly takes the adult literacy program into the workforce. It is considered to be a workforce program in the state of New Jersey. Less so maybe in other states where it still is housed in the Department of Education. So what do we have? We have adult literacy education as a workforce program. The second thing that happened is we lost our money for the high school, adult high school. We virtually, from that point of view, when there was reorganization, we had 21 different funding sources. We've lost most of them. We've lost the adult high school, which was a huge amount of money. We lost English for the foreign-born, which was a huge amount of money. And so we are left with primarily what we get from the feds. That money comes down from the feds to the state. State works out a NGO, which requires local programs to bid for the money. The process goes to the local level. Barry could talk about that for a bit. But that's pretty much the situation we have at the state level. Not enough money. We have a new commissioner of labor. His name is Robert Osorio Angello. He comes from the labor movement. That might mean that unions might be some good allies for us. The take so far we've heard about him is only positive. We have a new state director, Danielle Jadaniuk. Danielle, are you on?
She is, yeah.
Okay. I actually got your name right, maybe. Anyway, I think that's positive. So I think we're positioned to do some good stuff in the state. We just have to get organized to do it and to build upon the framework that Art has given us.
I don't think Barry's going to be able to join us. It looks like he's having some audio issues. So one of the things that you mentioned, Hal, is kind of how things filter down. So it goes from the feds to the state and then down to the localities. But one of the issues is that the funding stream is almost entirely kind of this federal distribution rather than state-generated funds, which means that these fluctuations at the federal level have a real impact on local programs in the state.
Right. It also means that we're restricted to what the federal program allows us to do. And
Right.
there's lots of things we could use funding for that would really make our programs much better, but we can't do it because it's not allowed in the federal program.
Right. Which is why, NJALL is increasingly turning its attention to trying to advocate at the state level for dedicated funding streams for adult education generated and distributed by the state, and not just the state redistributing funds that come from the federal level.
One major difference between the early days and now. In the early days, the emphasis was always on low-level learners, those in most of need. As a matter of fact, in the early days, there was a cap on what percentage of secondary level students you could serve. I think that is completely flip-flopped, with the emphasis on career and college transitions, with the emphasis on serving the most able because that's the least expensive. I think that the system now has oriented itself squarely for the most able learners, and that's something we really need to pay attention to. And that's an area where we might be able to use resources that we don't have.
Right. Programs are certainly incentivized to cream, right? The quicker you can get students through and the sooner you can get the outcome that you can, you can use with your metrics, the more you're going to do that. So then, since Barry can't chime in at this point, so here's time for those of you that are online. What thoughts do you have then kind of about these potential federal changes? So this year, there is this potential 7% increase, but as Art noted, that doesn't mean that that's what the case is going to be next year, right? Art, we don't know, right? On a year-to-year basis, we could be getting different amounts of funding from the federal government.
Yeah,
right?
that's correct.
Which means that federal level advocacy is a consistent thing, right? You're always thinking about making sure that the federal level representatives are supporting adult education. What state level changes do we need to make in terms of making sure that New Jersey actually supports adult education itself and not just redistributing federal money? And then what does that mean in sort of state level advocacy? And then how might this impact local level programs? And then what that means for local level advocacy. So for those of you that are here and online, I can either unmute you or you can share your thoughts or questions through the question area. What are you thinking now about at the federal level? What are you thinking now at the state level and the local level? And in particular, are there things that NJALL as an organization could do more of, or to try to help your organization and you as an individual get involved with this type of advocacy? Either through webinars or through in-person meetings or something. We get the conference coming up in May. So what are some of your thoughts?
Let me break the ice.
Okay. Go ahead, Al.
Like I said, I think Art's framework was extremely practical. And what we should do, or what we could do, is not say we're going to flood the state with letters, etc. Sit down and say, here's 5 things we want to do, can do, put dates on them, and do them. Letters to the governor at the right time, letters to legislatures at the right time, mobilizing students, 4 or 5 things that are practical, doable, have timelines on it. The second thing I think we need to do, which is really evident from Art's framework, is that we need to work more closely with programs at the program level.
Mm-hmm. So certainly it seems like one thing that NJALL can do is send out these timelines, like sort of, remind people of the process, where we are in the process, and what they can be doing as part of that. Do you do that, Art? Do you do that in New Hampshire? Do you kind of like keep a calendar as a ongoing thing that people can access so that they know where you're at in the process?
Well, I guess what we do is we send out at the beginning, and it's hard to figure out when an advocacy campaign starts because we're always doing it.
Right.
But we sort of in November we send something out, and here are the timelines because we know the governor sends his or her budget to the legislature the first week in February. And we know our letter writing capacity diminishes in the middle of December and sort of through the January till they pick up again, that if we're going to have any impact on the governor, we've got to get those letters there in November and early December. They got to be written in November and early December. So then we know when we know when the budget goes. We know when the crossover date is for the budget from the House to the Senate. So it doesn't do any good to be writing letters to members of the House after the budget has already gone to the Senate. And people understand the targeting issue, why we're focusing for these 3 weeks on these key people, but everybody's writing. So yeah, it's a 2-pager that sort of comes from my office, which is sort of a time frame. This is what we're doing here, this is what we're doing here, and so on. So I guess that's as close as it gets to having something available.
Okay. Rebecca wanted to share that she has a question about how we can impress upon everybody that the lowest level learners can't make significant gains in a short amount of time, right? Which is what the metrics demand. But over time, they can make these gains, get into higher education classes, get into work training, but they need funding for them, right? So this is certainly something that NJALL has been concerned about. And I think how we know this, and certainly as much as we can get the word out about the need to support these low level learners.
Well, and I think that comes through in the student letters. I have 3 or 4 examples of student letters that I use, and one that I always put in the packet is a hand-printed letter from a woman who was in an ESOL class. In the middle of this 2 paragraphs, she says, "I want to be able to learn English so I can help my children with their homework." And that particular letter is as powerful as another letter, which we have in there, someone who wants to go on to community college and wants to be able to start a business and so on. So that's where we get into the low level issues around students. They have to be in the faces of policymakers as well.
Yeah. Jane raises a good logistical point in terms of would there be a centralized place for the timeline info? I think certainly the new and revitalized NJALL website would be a place for that. But Jane also asked about receiving text message alerts, and I think that's a really good thought, right? Because we know that not everybody checks their email or uses their email in the same way that they used to, right? We've moved on to new platforms. So it's possible that the organization could explore sending out these text message alerts. Art, do you use text messaging up in New Hampshire?
We don't, but we've got a really tight email. I mean, it goes to all the local directors. In fact, I sent one this morning. We just found out this morning that there's a hearing before the House Education Committee next week on Wednesday morning on a bill which unfortunately got out of the Senate, which would limit access to state-funded adult education programs to only legal residents. And I mean, that's basically the way it works. So we got basically a 5-day window. That all went this morning to people. And within a half hour, I had copies of the letters that local adult education program directors had sent to all 18 members of the Education Committee. They're going to hear that bill next Wednesday. And also starting to line up the people who are going to testify. So it's not text messaging, and it could be done. I guess I just used that sort of this communication since 8 o'clock this morning around that hearing next Wednesday to say, we do what we need to do and we move quickly. And if we need to move quickly, we do that.
Okay. But Jane, I think we're going to follow up on that idea because I think we know that not everybody checks their email or opens their email, so that might be a way to increase the amount of students that get involved. And Rebecca suggests bilingual text messages for students to contract their legislators, right? So if we can send out bilingual messages via text, then people get their text instantaneously, unless you have my phone, in which case it kind of shows up at random times. Linda wants to know, is it more effective to send letters in bundles or in individual stamped envelopes? That's a good question, Linda.
It's more important to send them individually, but we've had some some that works in bundles. In Rhode Island, this is just 2 months ago, the governor was going to put a big cut in for adult ed in her budget that was going to the legislature. They had a meeting and delivered 1,000 letters, all packaged. Actually, they use postcards, but it's the same thing. So there is a role for putting them together. I think, though, since we want people, policymakers, to respond to individuals, it's better to have them come from individuals, and they get spread out over a period of time. We have programs that are running 500 and 600 letters, and so they get written probably within a 10-day period, and then they mail those over a period of 5 or 6 weeks. They don't mail them all at once.
So if we have a signing type event, we could have people sign the letters and put them in individual envelopes, and then we as an organization could slap the stamps on afterwards.
Certainly.
Okay. So Nick has a question about the mechanics of conducting advocacy, and it sounds like that your office takes a leadership role in advocacy efforts. So you're a state official, right? And you're involved in advocacy, whereas in New Jersey, it would kind of have to be us, right? So do you have thoughts about how to manage an advocacy campaign, sort of state leadership versus private leadership?
In the best of all possible worlds, there's a connection there. In many states, the state person can't do it, but he or she makes sure that all the information that's necessary goes to the professional association. In your case, you're the folks that are going to do this. This thing will work, and it has to be done, I suspect, at least initially, through the professional association. And as we know, professional associations don't do anything. It's the people in the professional associations that do that. So you're in a key, you have the key role in all of this.
Okay. All right. I know we're at the top of the hour. So other thoughts that people have, either about things that we can be doing better as an organization, that NJALL can be doing better as an organization, actions that you want to kind of help coordinate across the state, or questions you have about kind of how federal level changes may impact New Jersey. And certainly we're going to be talking at the conference in May. Ari Yankovic from the Literacy Assistance Center in New York is going to be talking about some of the advocacy work that they've done and how they've built networks and coalitions within New York. So we're looking forward to hearing from him. He'll give a plenary and then also lead a workshop on that. So if there's other things that people would like us to talk about at the conference, you can also let us know. Oh, Nancy, you want to be unmuted? Okay. Hi, Nancy. Oh, there's no. Nick, do you want to be unmuted? Hi, Nick. Did you want to weigh in on something? Nope. Oh, okay. I think the hand must have gone up accidentally. Okay. So, any other final thoughts? We'll certainly try to follow up with everybody. I think you guys have some good ideas, and we're really going to try to think about how we can move forward as an organization. I'd like to thank Art for sharing his insight and his wisdom, and Hal for the same. I'm sorry that Barry wasn't able to join us, but I'm sure we'll be able to share Barry's ideas somewhere down the road in a different format, maybe. And I'd like to thank all of you for coming online today.